There's a button every dwarf can press that turns their skin to stone. 8 seconds of it, give or take. The game files it under racial traits, sitting there between the bonus with firearms and the knack for sniffing out buried treasure, as if hardening into rock is the same category of thing as being handy with a rifle. You press it and the poison stops working, the bleeding closes, the fear slides off, and for a few seconds you are harder than you were a moment ago, useful in a fight, a tidy little panic button. Nobody in the tutorial mentions that it is also a memory. The dwarves did not always have skin. They were made of stone, all of them, every last one, and that button is the last flicker of what they used to be before something reached into them and turned them soft. Welcome to being a dwarf. This is the story of a people who spent their entire history digging up the past for a living, and who eventually dug up the one artifact they were not ready to find, which turned out to be themselves. You start in a place called Coldridge Valley, and it is, by the standards of this game, almost aggressively pleasant. Snow on everything, pine trees, a frozen little basin tucked into the southwestern corner of Dunmorrow with one road in and one road out, and at the center of it a stout stone keep called Anvilmar, where the recruits gather. The first dwarf you meet is named Steen Stoutarm, and Sten does not have an existential problem for you. Sten has a wolf problem. He would like 8 cuts of tough wolf meat off the ragged wolves down the slope, because the recruits need feeding and the wolves are right there. That's the first quest. Go make lunch out of the wildlife. It is about as far from a cosmic reckoning as a quest can get, and that gap between the coziness of what you're doing and the enormity of what you are is the whole engine of the dwarven experience. The game just doesn't tell you that yet. So you kill the wolves, you gather the meat, you come back and there's another dwarf, Balor Frosthammer, with a slightly less domestic request. Something is clawing up out of the ground. They're called trogs, and they are squat, hunched, grey, stone-skinned things with flat faces and no conversation, and they have started boiling up out of the earth at the valley's edges, swinging at anything warm. Balor wants you to go thin them out, rockjaw trogs, the burly ones especially. So you do. You go down into the hills and you kill the things crawling out of the rock, and they drop a little coin, and you turn the quest in, and you move on to the next one, which is about a troll cave, and the next one after that, which is about crag boars, and the game keeps you moving fast enough that you never stop in front of a dead trog long enough to really look at it, which is a shame because if you did look, you might notice it has the same build you do. Short, broad, thick through the shoulders, made apparently of something close to stone. The trogs are not random monsters that wandered into the valley. They are, and the game will not say this to you for a very long time, your cousins. The rough draft. The version the makers tried first and threw away, and they are crawling out of the exact same ground your own ancestors slept in. You are, in the most literal sense available, killing your own failed prototypes for experience points, and the tutorial has framed it as pest control. Anyway, there's a gnome refugee in Anvilmar named Felix who's lost his belongings to a troll camp, and the trolls in question are the Frostmane, and they matter more than the game lets on to. The Frostmane are ice trolls, and they were here first. Long before a single dwarf ever set foot in Dunmorrow, this was troll country. The dwarves moved in, built their kingdom on top of the trolls' ancestral ground, and pushed them up into the ridges and the caves, and now the Frostmane raid down out of the cold, trying to take back a sliver of what used to be theirs, and the game hands you a quest to go kill their whelps in a cave. From the dwarven side, they're a menace. From the troll side, you're the invader who won, and they're the ones who lost, and every raid is just a people who got displaced, trying to claw back a corner of home. The game gives you the dwarven side. It always gives you the dwarven side. You clear the cave. You round out Coldridge with the small stuff, the mail deliveries, the observations for a dwarf named Senner who's tracking the Trog incursion, and then you're pointed at Coldridge Pass, a tunnel to the northeast. That's the only way out of the valley. It's infested with more trogs, because of course it is, and you push through the dark and the swinging grey bodies and come out the other side into the wider world, which for a dwarf means the rest of Dun Morogh. And before you go, the game has quietly handed you your kit, the traits that mark what a dwarf is. You can shrug off frost, which makes sense for a people who live in a permanent blizzard. You're unusually good with guns, because dwarves basically invented the personal firearm on this continent, and roughly half the technology in the world is theirs. You can find treasure nobody else can see, buried chests lighting up on your map, because a dwarf's instinct for what's hidden in the ground runs deep enough to be a game mechanic, and you can turn to stone. They give you all of it at level 1, no ceremony, like a starter pack. The gun and the frost resistance and the greed in the stone. That's a dwarf mechanically. It'll take the rest of this story to explain why the stone one is the one that matters. The road out of Coldridge climbs and opens, and you get your first proper look at Dun Morogh, which is a genuinely gorgeous zone in a way the game rarely bothers with in a starting area. Snowfields rolling out under a grey sky, great dark pines heavy with snow, frozen lakes you can walk across, wolves howling somewhere up in the crags. It is cold and vast and quiet, and threaded through all of it is the warm yellow light of dwarven settlements, because the dwarves have done to this frozen mountain range exactly what dwarves do to everything, which is move in and make it cozy through sheer stubbornness. You come down the road to Khaz'goroth, the main town, and Khaz'goroth is the dwarven starting experience distilled into one street, a tavern, a forge, caravans, dwarves standing around with the posture of people who are cold but fundamentally fine about it. The tavern is the Thunderbrew distillery, run by the Thunderbrew family, and one of them, Ragnar, greets you not with a warning about ancient evil, but with a request for beer-basted boar ribs, which requires you to go collect boar ribs and, crucially, some of Thunderbrew's own ale to baste them with. This is a real quest. A significant chunk of your early dwarven life is, in the most sincere possible way, about food and alcohol, and this is not the game being lazy, this is characterization. The dwarves are the one race in this entire setting whose culture is built, visibly and proudly, around comfort. Ale, meat, a warm forge, good company, a firearm within reach. Where the elves are dying beautifully and the undead are processing their grief through paperwork, the dwarves are making sure the ribs are properly basted. It is the healthiest civilization in the game, emotionally speaking, and it is sitting directly on top of the bleakest origin story in the game, and neither of those facts has any idea about the other. You run the errands, you fetch ale for Rayold Barley Brew over in Brunel Village, who is genuinely, as a full-time job, trying to perfect a beer recipe while the world burns. You clear trogs out of Golbolar Quarry, a mining pit to the east that the grey things have overrun, which is your second or third go now at killing your own prototypes without knowing it. You head up to Amberstill Ranch to help with the rams and deal with a wolf named Vagash that's been savaging the herd. You track down a yeti. It is all small, all local, all deeply human in a way that has nothing to do with humans. Nobody is asking you to save the world. They're asking you to help hold a snowy protectorate together against the trogs pressing in from below and the trolls pressing in from the ridges, and to bring back the ale while you're at it. The ones actually holding that line are the mountaineers, the dwarven riflemen, posted at the passes and outposts all across Dun Morogh, standing in the snow with their guns and their rams, quietly making sure the trogs and the trolls never quite break through. They're the backbone of the whole zone, and the game barely gives them a spoken line, which is very on brand for the dwarves. The people doing the actual work of keeping everyone safe are out in the cold, unbothered, unthanked, and completely fine with that. And there's a wound in the middle of all this that the dwarves are very quiet about, which is Gnomrigan. To the northwest of Ironforge sits the ruined city of the gnomes, the dwarves' closest friends and allies, and it is a tomb now. The gnomes' own machines, or rather a catastrophe involving radiation and a Trog invasion and a leader who made a terrible call, turned their shining underground city into a poisoned ruin, and the survivors fled to Ironforge and never really got their home back. You can see the leper gnomes still shambling around the entrance, irradiated, hostile, former citizens. The gnomes took in the dwarves' cause, joined the alliance beside them, gave up their entire civilization, and got a district of Ironforge and a lot of sympathy in return. It's the kind of thing that would be a whole tragedy in another race's zone. Here it's a bit of ambient sorrow you jog past on your way to the ranch, which brings us, eventually, up the long ramp to the gates and through them into Ironforge itself. And Ironforge is where you finally understand what these people can do. You walk in and the temperature changes. It's warm. It's the first warm place you've been, because the entire city is built around the forge, and not a metaphorical one. The Great Forge sits in the middle of Ironforge like a small sun, a vast ring of molten metal and fire and anvils, and the whole city radiates out from it in a wheel, warm and gold and loud with the ringing of hammers. This is a city carved directly into the heart of a mountain by a people who looked at solid rock and decided it was simply a room that hadn't been hollowed out yet. There's no sky. There doesn't need to be. The dwarves took the coldest, hardest, most unwelcoming place imaginable, the frozen inside of a mountain, and turned it into the warmest city in the world. It's laid out in wards, and the wards tell you what the dwarves value. There's the military ward, full of weapon masters and trainers, because these people take defense seriously. There's the mystic ward for the magic users. There's the commons, the big market, where the everyday life of the city happens. There's Tinker Town off to the side, and Tinker Town is where the gnomes live now, the refugees, tinkering away with their gadgets in the one corner of somebody else's city they've been given, a whole displaced people reduced to a neighborhood. There's one more room worth stopping in, the Hall of Explorers, a museum and library set into the city where the dwarves keep the spoils of their new obsession, fossils and relics and titan fragments hauled in from every corner of the world, watched over by the scholars of the Explorers League. It's arguably the most important room in Ironforge, because it's where the dwarves keep all the pieces of the question they can't stop asking. And if you ever get tired of the mountain, there's a train. The dwarves and gnomes bored a tunnel clean through the bones of the world, the Deep Run tram, a rattling underground railway that runs beneath the sea all the way to the human capital of Stormwind, because a people who tunnel for a living were never going to let a little ocean sit between them and their allies. And at the top, in the high seat, sits the king, King Magni Bronzebeard. And you should look at Magni for a moment, because in the era we're standing in, he is one of the most stable, respected, genuinely beloved rulers in the entire world. Great grey beard, broad as a door, he rules the Bronzebeard clan, and through them all of Ironforge and the mountainous realm of Khaz'goroth around it. He brought the dwarves into the alliance during the Second War, when the orcs came pouring through the mountains, and he swore the dwarves would forever owe a debt of honor to the alliance for helping free their land. He forged with his own hands at that great forge a legendary blade meant to fight the undead, pouring his grief and his rage into every hammer strike after he got word that his younger brother had died in the frozen north. He is a good king. He is, as far as anyone in Ironforge is concerned, the rock the whole kingdom stands on, and the game means for you to feel that when you look up at him on the high seat, a good stone king solid as the mountain, with no idea yet how literally that will one day turn out to be true. Because here is the thing Magni did that reshaped his entire people. At some point, the dwarves started digging up ruins that weren't dwarven, older than almost anything, and Magni, driven by a question that apparently would not leave him alone, made a decree that changed dwarven civilization at the root. He ordered his people to turn away from what they'd always done, the mining and the engineering and the smithing, and pour that same energy into a new obsession, archaeology. He founded the Explorers League, a guild of dwarves devoted to one thing, digging up the ancient world and finding out, once and for all, where the dwarves actually came from. Some people call them the Explorers Guild. I mostly think of them as a legion of stout, bearded, heavily armed Indiana Joneses, spreading out across the entire world with picks and shovels and rifles, cracking open every ancient vault they can find. And the reason they're doing it, the thing driving the whole enterprise, is that the dwarves had realized they did not actually know what they were. They had a folk memory, a sense that they came from the mountains, a vague reverence for something old, but the real answer was buried, literally, and they went to dig it up. The place where they found it is called Uldaman. Uldaman is a titan vault, buried in the mountains to the south, in the Badlands, and to explain what a titan vault is, I have to back up to the beginning of nearly everything. The titans are the closest thing this universe has to gods, enormous cosmic beings of order who traveled from world to world, and when they found a world with a slumbering soul at its center, a world soul, they would shape that world, order it, protect it, and move on. Azeroth was one of those worlds, and it was not just any world. The soul sleeping in its core was, by the Titans' own reckoning, the most powerful they had ever found. A nascent god still growing in the dark, under the crust, which made this single planet the most important rock in the cosmos and the one their enemies wanted most. And it had a problem, which was that it had already been colonized before the Titans arrived by something much worse, the old gods, vast insane tentacled horrors that had sunk their roots into the planet like a cancer and raised up an empire of madness across its surface, the Black Empire. The Titans, or rather their lieutenants, a set of powerful constructs called the Keepers, went to war with the old gods to save the world's sleeping soul. And to fight that war and to do the endless work of shaping a planet, they needed labor. They needed servants who could work stone, who could sculpt mountains and carve out the deep places and hold the world together while its makers moved on. So, one of the Titans, khaz'goroth, the Shaper, the one associated with forging and the deep earth, set his keepers to building those servants, and their first attempt went wrong. The keepers built a machine called the Forge of Wills, and they fed it a design, a blueprint, for a living creature made of the planet's own bedrock, something they called the subterranean being, Matrix, a person made of living stone, strong enough to sculpt the very rock they were made from. And the first things that came out of the forge were wrong, brutal, misshapen, powerful but stupid, savage. The keepers looked at what they'd made and recoiled. These were the Trogs, the very first attempt at a Titan-forged servant of the deep earth, and it was a failure, a botched casting, strength without a mind to guide it. The keepers couldn't quite bring themselves to destroy them, so they did something that tells you a great deal about the makers. They swept the failures into vaults, sealed them underground, and locked the door. Out of sight. Try again. The second attempt worked. The keepers refined the design, and out of the Forge of Wills came a new race of stone-skinned beings, craggy and strong, and this time clever, kind even, patient, good with their hands. They called them the Earthen, and the Earthen were exactly what the Titans had wanted, an army of living stone that fanned out across the whole planet and got to work, tunneling the deep places, raising the mountains, laying down the veins of energy that run under the world's skin. For a long age, the earthen did the maker's work, and they were, by every account, happy in it. They were made of the mountain, they belonged to it, and when the great work was far enough along, some of them gathered around the eastern vault, called Uldaman, and the keepers there carved out chambers to hold their most precious records, and vowed to guard them until the end of the world. Those records are the reason the dwarves ever learned any of this. Deep in Uldaman sit the discs of Norgannon, sometimes called the Platinum Discs, and they are, functionally, the universe's hard drive. Titan artifacts that recorded the history of Azeroth as it happened, along with the Maker's own experiments, their designs, their failures, the whole classified file on how life on this planet was engineered, and the Explorers League digging through Uldaman found them. Dwarven excavators cracking open an ancient vault looking for their heritage pulled out a set of metal discs that turned out to contain the literal blueprint of their own creation. It's the single most on-the-nose thing that ever happens to this race. They spent generations digging for the answer to where do we come from, and the answer was a technical manual, and they were an entry in it. And Uldaman was only the most important dig, not the only one. By the time you're out wandering the world as a dwarf, the Explorers League is everywhere, camped in the Badlands, cracking open the ruins of Baal Modan, down in the Barrens, picking through Tanaris and the deserts and every half-buried Titan structure they can reach, hauling crate after crate of relics back to that Hall of Explorers. They're so relentless about it that the Horde eventually stands up a mirror image organization, the Reliquary, specifically to race them to the artifacts and keep the Blood Elves and the Forsaken from being locked out of the past entirely. Two factions sprinting to excavate a history that turns out to belong to both of them. The dwarves kicked off a worldwide gold rush for the truth, and everyone else had to scramble to keep up. Getting to the discs is not simple, mind you. The vault has a guardian, a massive titan construct of living stone named Arcadas, who sits in the deepest chamber and animates the walls themselves against intruders, waking sleeping stone golems out of the very architecture to crush anyone who gets close. And there's a keeper of the records down there too, the lore keeper of Norgannon, and when the intruders finally break through and stand in front of the discs, the lore keeper materializes and, calmly, in the flat, patient voice of a being that has been waiting underground for 8,000 years to explain something, tells them the truth. The whole thing, the forge, the failed trogs, the earthen, all of it. It just stands there and reads a grieving, curious people the file on their own origin, and the truth in that file is worse and stranger than anyone digging for it expected, because it doesn't just answer where did we come from. It answers a question the dwarves had never even thought to ask, which is why are we made of flesh at all? Because the earthen were made of stone, and the dwarves are not. So somewhere between the ancient stone servants and the warm, bearded, ale-drinking people running Ironforge, something happened. Something reached into a race of living rock and turned it soft. And the discs have a name for it. They call it the Curse of Flesh. To understand the curse, you have to go back to that war between the Titans and the old gods, because the old gods did not lose cleanly. The keepers won. They chained the old gods deep in the world rather than killing them, because killing them might have killed the planet the horrors were rooted into. But chained is not gone, and from down in their prisons, the old gods kept whispering, kept working, kept looking for a way to unmake the order the Titans had imposed, and they found one. They found the Titan Forged, the whole population of stone servants, and they infected them with a kind of corruption that did something almost poetic in its cruelty. It made them mortal. The curse of flesh spread through the Titan-forged races, and slowly, over generations, turned their stone hide to skin, their crystal to blood, their perfect ordered forms into soft, warm, breakable aging bodies that could get sick and get hungry and want things and die. The old god's great weapon against the servants of order was to make them people. It gets darker because one of the keepers turned, a keeper named Loken, the one the Titans had actually put in charge, betrayed his makers, murdered his own kind, and let the curse of flesh run wild through the Forge of Wills itself, so that the corruption was baked into every new being the machine produced. The whole system that made the Earthen was poisoned at the source. The Earthen felt it coming. Some of them, sensing that something was wrong with their own bodies, went to the Keepers and were afraid, and the Keepers made them a promise. They would be put into hibernation, sealed in the deep vaults, Uldaman and Uldum and Ulduar, and they would sleep there safe until a cure could be found, and one day they'd be woken up whole. So the Earthen went to sleep in the dark, trusting that they'd wake up as themselves. They did not wake up as themselves. When the great cataclysm called the Sundering tore the world apart, thousands of years passed, and the sleeping Earthen slept through all of it, and the promised cure never came, and the curse kept working on them, even in their sleep. And when they finally stirred and climbed out of the vaults, blinking into a changed world, they reached up to touch their own faces and found skin. Their stone had gone soft. Their strength over rock had faded to a whisper. They were shorter, warmer, breakable. They were mortal. They were not earthen anymore. They called themselves dwarves, and the trogs, the failures, the first draft sealed in those same vaults, the curse got to them too, except where it turned the earthen into dwarves. Something about the trogs, some interference, some deeper corruption, twisted them the other way. They came out of the ground savage and broken and mindless, all that titan strength with nothing behind the eyes, the same curse, the same vaults, the same origin, and it produced two things. It produced the dwarves and it produced the trogs, which means the grey things clawing out of the ground in Coldridge Valley, the ones you were killing for a few copper in the first 10 minutes, are not the dwarves' enemies in any clean sense. They're the dwarves' brothers, the other branch, the version of you that the curse broke instead of merely softening. Every dwarf is a trog that got lucky and every trog is a dwarf that didn't, and they are still both crawling out of the same holes in the same mountains, one of them building cities and basting ribs, the other one swinging blindly at the light, and the dwarves and the trogs aren't even the whole family. Down in Uldaman, alongside the sleeping earthen, the Titans had left mechanical caretakers to mind the machinery, small, clever, metal beings called mechagnomes. The curse of flesh found them too. It softened their gears into skin and their wiring into nerves, and turned them, over long ages, into small, clever, soft, restlessly curious creatures who wandered out of the vaults and went on to build a shining underground city of their own. The gnomes, the very same gnomes now huddled in Tinkertown as refugees, the ones whose poisoned home you jogged past on the way to the ranch. They are not the dwarves, quirky little sidekicks by coincidence. They are the dwarves' cousins, the other successful casting, flesh made out of titan machinery, the way the dwarves are flesh made out of titan stone. Two survivors of the same curse who found each other and never let go. The stoutest friendship in the Alliance is really two branches of one abandoned family holding hands in the dark. Nobody in Coldridge Valley tells you this. You just kill the trogs and turn in the quest. The dwarves that came out of Uldaman were drawn west toward a range of great stone mountains, and they settled the snowy region we've been standing in this whole time, and named the land Khaz-Modan, which means Mountain of Khaz, in honor of Khaz'goroth, the titan who forged their ancestors. Even freshly woken and stripped of their stone, some deep instinct still remembered the maker's name. They dug into the tallest mountain, built their immense forge at its heart, and raised the city of Ironforge around it. So when you stand in that warm golden city, looking up at Magni on the high seat, you're standing inside a monument that a race of amnesiac ex-golems built to a titan they only half remembered, in a language that still carried his name. The whole city is a memory they didn't know they were keeping. For a long time, the dwarves lived like that, one people under one mountain, and for the last stretch of it, they were ruled by a single high king, an old and wise dwarf named Modimus Anvilmar, who held all of dwarfkind together under one crown. And under that crown, 3 great families had grown up, 3 clans, and the balance between them was the thing Modimus's authority quietly held in place. There were the Bronzebeards, the largest clan, the traditional defenders of the mountain, tough and stubborn and closely tied to the king, who thought of themselves as the backbone of the whole kingdom and were a little suspicious of everyone else. There were the Wildhammers, who never much liked living sealed inside the mountain and preferred the crags and the open sky outside it, proud and rugged, and considered a bit uncouth by their city cousins, always feeling like they didn't get the respect or the say they'd earned. And there were the Dark Irons, who went the opposite direction, down into the deepest and darkest corners under the city, led by a sorcerer named Thaurissan, ambitious and resentful and clever, with a kind of magic the other 2 clans found unsettling, brooding in the shadows, and, if the histories are to be believed, quietly plotting against both of their brothers. 3 clans, 1 mountain, 1 aging king, holding it together. You can see the shape of what's coming. Modimus Anvilmar died of old age, and before his heir could be crowned, the whole thing came apart. Nobody can say for certain which clan struck the first blow. The records blame the Dark Irons and a failed grab for the throne, but the records were written by the winners, so keep a hand on that. What's certain is that the moment the old king was gone, the balance he'd been holding collapsed, and the 3 clans went for each other's throats. The dwarves call it the War of the 3 Hammers, and it happened a bit over 2 centuries before the Dark Portal ever opened, and it was a civil war fought in the dark, under the mountain, in the tunnels and the great halls, for years. 3 families who shared blood and a home and a maker, tearing that home apart from the inside over who got to sit in a dead man's chair. The Bronzebeards had the biggest army and the best position, and in the end, they won the mountain. They drove the other 2 clans out of Ironforge entirely, and this is the part where the moral tidiness the histories want you to feel starts to wobble, because banishing your defeated brothers into the cold is not, obviously, the act of the good guys, and the 2 exiled clans did not go quietly into a happy ending. The Wildhammers, beaten and bitter, marched east and north and tried to build a new home, first at a grim fortress called Grim Battle, and later, after that went wrong, at a beautiful open-air city called Airy Peak in the hinterlands, where they gave up on the whole idea of living sealed in stone, bonded with the great griffins of the mountains, leaned into shamanism and the open sky, and became something genuinely different from their Ironforge cousins. They landed on their feet, more or less. They found a way to be dwarves that didn't require winning, and in time the Bronzebeards and the Wildhammers even patched things up, building a massive double-arched bridge called the Thandal Span to link Khaz to the northern kingdoms and keep trade flowing between the clans. And after their old leaders passed, their sons raised statues to them at the border, less a monument to a war than a quiet promise not to fight it again. The Wildhammers on their griffins went on to become some of the fiercest skyfighters the Alliance ever had, and the breach between the 2 clans slowly healed into something close to family. The Dark Irons did not land on their feet. Humiliated, enraged, driven out of their ancestral home by the family that had always looked down on them, they went south under Taurisan and built a city, which Thaurissan named after himself because subtlety was never the Dark Iron's strong suit, and they nursed their grievance into something that stopped being grievance and became a plan. They were going to take revenge on Ironforge, and so, years later, the Dark Irons launched a two-pronged surprise attack, Thaurissan himself leading an army against Ironforge, while his wife, a sorceress named Modgood, led a second army against the Wildhammers at grim battle, a coordinated strike to shatter both of the clans that had wronged them in a single blow. It very nearly worked. Both attacks drove deep, but at Ironforge, Madoran Bronzebeard finally rallied his people and threw Thaurissan back, and Thaurissan fled south to his city, not knowing how the other battle had gone. And the other battle had gone badly for his wife. Modgood was a genuinely terrifying figure, and when she besieged Grim Battle, she turned the whole fortress into a nightmare, pulling shadows out of the walls and sending dark things crawling up out of the deep places to hunt the Wildhammers through their own halls. But Cardros Wildhammer, the Wildhammer Thane, waded through the whole horror show and killed her himself in the thick of it, and Modgood, dying, laid a curse on Grim Battle so foul that the Wildhammers could never live there again. She poisoned their home with her death. That's why the Wildhammers ended up at Airy Peak. Their own conquered fortress became unlivable because a dying sorceress salted the earth on her way out. Now the two victorious clans, Bronzebeard and Wildhammer, put aside a war's worth of bad blood because they'd found something they hated more than each other, and they turned their combined armies south toward Thaurissan City to end the Dark Iron clan forever. And Thaurissan, trapped in his own capital, watching two armies close in from the north, getting word that his wife was dead and his second army destroyed, did the thing that desperate people with access to forbidden power always seem to do in this world. He reached for something bigger than himself. He and his most powerful sorcerers, a cabal called the Seven, began a summoning, pulling on a fiery power sleeping deep beneath the mountains, hoping to yank up a weapon terrible enough to save them. They succeeded. That was the problem. What Thaurissan pulled up out of the deep was Ragnaros the Fire Lord, an elemental lord of pure fire and fury, one of the ancient forces the Titans themselves had bound away for good reason. And there is a rule in this world, an iron one, that the dwarves were about to learn the hard way, and that every other race learns eventually too. If you reach down into the dark and drag something up because you need its power, it does not become your servant, it becomes your problem. Ragnaros erupted into the world, and his arrival was an apocalypse. The sheer force of it shattered the mountains, cracked the land open, and raised a volcano where the dark iron city had stood, a black cone of fire and ash now called Black Rock Mountain, ringed by scorched wasteland, the searing gorge to the north, and the burning steppes to the south, land that is still burning to this day. Thaurissan, the sorcerer who summoned him, the whole point of the ritual, died in the first instant, incinerated by the thing he'd called. The Seven died with him, and the surviving dark iron dwarves, the whole clan, the people Thaurissan had been trying to save, did not get saved. They got enslaved. Ragnaros looked at the desperate dwarves who'd freed him and made them his property, bound them to his service inside the burning mountain, and there they have remained, generation after generation, a whole people who reached for a weapon to avoid extinction, and instead traded their freedom to a fire god forever. The Bronzebeard and Wildhammer armies, marching south to finish the Dark Irons, crested a rise, saw the volcano being born, and felt the heat of Ragnaros on their faces, and turned around and went home. There was nothing left to conquer. The Dark Irons had been conquered by something far worse than anything their cousins could have done to them. And this is where I want to slow down on the Dark Irons, because it would be very easy to file them under villains and move on. They attacked their own family, they summoned a demon of fire and doomed everyone. From the Bronzebeard side, they're the treacherous clan, the ones who couldn't accept a loss, the ones who brought hell up out of the ground, but run it the other way. The Dark Irons were the clan that got driven out. They lost the war, lost their home, got banished into exile by the family that had always treated them as lesser, and were being marched upon by two armies who had openly pledged to purge them from the world entirely. They were not being offered a peace, they were being offered annihilation, and a cornered people, told there is no future for them, reached for the only thing that might save their children, and it destroyed them. That's not a story about villains, that's a story about what desperation does to the people who lose. The Dark Irons are a whole clan that made one catastrophic choice under the worst pressure imaginable and paid for it with an eternity of slavery, and the dwarves of Ironforge, the ones you're playing, are the winners who get to remember it as a cautionary tale rather than a tragedy. The story of the Dark Irons isn't over either, and it loops directly back into what you'll actually do as a dwarf at the top end of Classic, because the Dark Irons didn't just vanish into slavery and disappear from the plot. Under Blackrock Mountain they built a new subterranean city, Shadowforge, and over the generations they became a real power again in their own grim way, ruled eventually by an emperor named Dagran Taurisan, a descendant of the very sorcerer who doomed them. And when you're level 60 and you finally march a raid into the depths of Blackrock, into the great dungeon called Blackrock Depths, you're walking into that Dark Iron city, and one of the things you find there is a dwarf who does not belong. Her name is Moira, and she is King Magni Bronzebeard's daughter. The Dark Irons took her, and in one of the strangest, saddest wrinkles in the whole Dwarven saga, she did not want to be rescued. She had fallen in love with Emperor Dagran Taurisan, the Dark Iron ruler, and married him, and was carrying his child, a child who would carry both the Bronzebeard and the Dark Iron bloodlines. And an alliance raid sent to save the king's daughter kills her husband in front of her, and she is not grateful. She is a widow now, and her rescuers are her husband's killers, and she goes home to an Ironforge that sees her as a traitor for having loved the wrong dwarf. The clean story of good Bronzebeards and evil Dark Irons falls apart the moment you look at Moira's face. And deeper still, below even Shadowforge City, past a molten door the Dark Irons were never meant to open, waits the thing that started all of it. Ragnaros never left. He's down there in the molten core, the fiery heart of Blackrock Mountain, still lord of the enslaved Dark Irons, and the very last thing a band of level 60 heroes does in Classic, the final mountain to climb in the whole original game, is descend into that fire and put the Fire Lord down. Which means the Dwarven story, the one that opened with a fresh recruit killing wolves for stew in a snowy valley, ends with that same character standing in a lake of lava, killing a fire god that a desperate cousin summoned 2 centuries before they were born. The whole arc is a single unbroken line from the wolf pelts to the Fire Lord, and almost nobody playing it ever notices they've been following one family's tragedy the entire way down. But that's the deep end. Back near the surface in the warm gold city, the dwarfs you're actually living among have made a very different peace with their history, and it runs through 3 brothers, because Magni Bronzebeard, the good Stone King on the high seat, is one of 3, the eldest of 3 brothers, and the 3 of them together are basically the Dwarven soul split into its 3 moods. Magni is the king, the anchor, the one who stayed home and held the mountain and bore the weight of the crown. The second brother is Muradin, and Muradin is the wanderer, the warrior, the one who went out into the world looking for adventure and battle, and the youngest is Bran, and Bran is the explorer, the one who caught the archaeology bug hardest of all, who has personally dug through nearly every ancient ruin on the planet and written it all down, the most famous member of that Explorers League, the living embodiment of the dwarven need to know where things come from. And Muradin's story is the one that reaches out of the dwarven zones and touches the darkest chapter in the whole setting, because Muradin is the dwarf who went to the frozen north, to Northrend, at the head of an expedition, hunting a legendary blade, and in Northrend he met a young human prince he trained years before, a prince named Arthas, who was hunting the same blade for reasons that had curdled into obsession. Muradin found the sword first, and he read the warning on it, and he understood what it was, a cursed rune blade that would take everything from whoever wielded it, and he told Arthas to leave it alone. Arthas did not leave it alone. Arthas took the blade, Frostmourne, and the taking of it shattered the ward around it, and the ice came down, and Muradin was struck and fell, and Arthas, already gone, already becoming the thing he'd become, stepped over the body of the dwarf who'd raised him and walked off to damn the world. Back home, word reached Ironforge that Muradin was dead, killed in the north by the prince he trusted, and Magni, the eldest brother, the king, took that grief down to the Great Forge and hammered it into a sword, that legendary blade against the undead, willing all his rage into the steel. He built a weapon out of mourning his brother. He was mourning a brother who wasn't dead. Muradin survived that blow, wandered the northern wastes for years, with no memory of who he was, and was found and taken in by a clan of frost-dwelling dwarves, who made him their leader under a name he'd invented for himself because he couldn't remember his own, but nobody in Ironforge knew that. For years, as far as the dwarves were concerned, one of the three brothers was simply gone, killed by the same prince who went on to become the Lich King, and the family carried that hole in it. The dwarves have given a lot to the wars of this world and gotten a lot of grief back, and Muradin's empty chair is a good example of how they tend to end up, showing up for everyone else's fight, paying for it in their own blood, and holding the line anyway, because that's the dwarves' role in the Alliance in the end. They're the reliable ones, not the tragic beautiful elves, not the noble grieving humans, not the exotic anyone. The dwarves are the ones who show up with guns and griffins and stubbornness, who forged the Alliance's weapons and dug its tunnels and held its western flank, who took in the gnomes when the gnomes had nowhere else, who lost brothers in Northrend and Clan Kin under Blackrock and kept their word to their allies through all of it. When Magni brought the dwarves into the Alliance, he framed it as a debt of honor, and the dwarves have spent every war since paying a debt they arguably didn't owe, because that's who they decided to be. Where the Blood Elves Alliance was a transaction dressed up as a fellowship, the dwarves was a fellowship they've kept treating as sacred long after it stopped being convenient. Now go back and look at your abilities one more time, the little starter kit the game handed you at level 1, and read them as a portrait. You're good with guns because the dwarves refused to stay a race that fought only with axes in the dark and taught themselves engineering and firearms until half the technology on the continent was theirs, a people made of stone who chose to become the setting's tinkerers and inventors. You shrug off frost because you built the warmest civilization in the world inside the coldest place in it, out of pure refusal to be uncomfortable. You find buried treasure nobody else can see because the instinct for what's hidden in the ground is written into you at the level of a game mechanic, an old pull toward the deep places you were literally made to work, and you can turn to stone. For 8 seconds in a fight, your soft cursed flesh remembers what it used to be, hardens back toward the earth you descend from, becomes for a moment the thing the titans built before the old gods reached in, and made you mortal. The dwarves believe stone form is only the first step, that if they keep learning, keep digging, keep reclaiming what they lost, they might one day take back more of their stone inheritance. It's a racial ability. It's also a whole people trying to remember how to be what they were before they were cursed into being people. And here's the part where I'll drop the jokes, because the dwarves have earned a straight answer to the question their whole existence poses. Every race in this game is running from something, but the dwarves are the only ones running toward the thing that should terrify them, and doing it with shovels and good cheer. They went looking on purpose for the truth about where they came from, and what they found was that they are a titan's rough tool, a race of golems built to sculpt a planet and then abandoned mid-project, infected by cosmic horrors with the disease of being alive, left to sleep in the dark while their makers never came back, and woken up changed into something their creators would have called a failure. They are, by the cold logic of their own origin, a mistake, a side effect, the curse of flesh working as intended on a servant race that was never supposed to have hopes or hunger or grief. And knowing all of that, having read it off a titan's own records in the bottom of a vault, the dwarves' response was not despair. It was to go home, pour a beer, keep digging, and decide that if being made of flesh is a curse, then they were going to be the warmest, stubbornest, most stubbornly alive curse the world had ever seen. They turned the worst news any race ever received into an excuse to love being here. That is, quietly, the most heroic thing anyone in this setting does, and they do it without a single dramatic speech, mostly while basting ribs. And then, because this is still a fantasy game, and the universe has a sense of humor, the good Stone King eventually decides to solve a crisis by communing directly with the soul of the world, performs an ancient ritual in the deepest heart of Ironforge, and turns slowly, completely, into a living statue of solid diamond, fused into the rock at the center of his own city. Magni Bronzebeard, the dwarf who sent his whole people digging for their stone inheritance, becomes stone, goes all the way back, presses the stone form button and never lets go. The king who ruled the race that used to be earthen ends up as the most literal earthen of them all, a diamond dwarf with his ear pressed to the heartbeat of the planet. And honestly, of all the ways for that particular story to rhyme, you could not have written it cleaner. So that's the dwarves. They were built out of a mountain by a god who left. They were cursed into flesh by horrors that wanted to unmake them, and the curse turned them into people, and they decided that was a gift and not a wound. They lost their stone, lost their memory, lost a whole clan to a fire god, lost brothers in wars that were mostly other people's, and they kept the forge lit through all of it. They are the one race that went looking for the bottom of their own story, found something cold and vast and inhuman down there, and climbed back out to build a warmer city on top of it. The trogs are still crawling out of the ground in Coldridge Valley, the cursed cousins who didn't get lucky, swinging at the light, and a fresh dwarf is standing over one of them right now, in the snow, having just turned it in for a few copper, with no idea that the great thing at their feet is family, or that the stone under the snow is their birthright, or that the button on their action bar that hardens their skin is the oldest thing about them. They'll find out. The dwarves always dig down, eventually. It's the one thing the makers built into them, that the curse never managed to take out. If this is the kind of story you'd like more of, the simplest way to tell me is a like and a subscribe, so the next one finds you on its own. I make these on my own, so it genuinely helps. There's always another buried vault, another people who went digging for their past and found something they weren't ready for, another warm light somebody built on top of a cold truth because the alternative was to sit in the dark. I'd like to keep digging through them with you. The forge is still burning, the stone is still under the snow, and somewhere down in the deep places, older than the king, older than the city, older than flesh itself, the mountain still remembers what the dwarves were before they were people, and it is patient and it is waiting, the way stone always waits for them to come home